so our philosophy with these older formats is definitely a lot more based on the community sentiment, given how, you know, when you're a legacy player, you have to invest a lot into playing legacy. Same with vintage, you know, owning Power 9, owning all these fetch lands, duels, it's difficult. So when we talk about these sort of formats, we really want to make sure that we're listening to the community first and foremost. So we like to track, obviously we'll still track win rates, play rates, all that kind of stuff. And we'll look at these graphs and think, hey, is there anything crazy here? But unlike for those other formats, we're going to focus mostly on how the community is talking about the format and if they enjoyed the most.
On March 31st, Wizards of the Coast will announce their latest banned and restricted update. They have previously stated that the main driver for vintage bans and restrictions is community sentiment. So, I am compelled to make my own video detailing my personal opinions on what should be done for vintage. My name is Justin, I'm actually level 1, and this is Voice of Vintage. Welcome back, vintage gamers, to a video that I really didn't want to make. You're going to see that I don't particularly enjoy ban and restriction discussion. In fact, I wish I could talk about restrictions far less than we actually do. But in today's world where WotC has said outright that community sentiment is the main driving force behind restrictions, I feel like I'm compelled to put out my own opinions into a video. If I were to just stay silent and not release anything, then it feels like I'm giving up my stake inside of this community sentiment. If I'm silent, then aren't other louder voices going to take my place? It feels pretty silly because honestly, I might have the biggest megaphone when it comes to vintage. If I make this video, then maybe it's just the opposite. And instead of not having my voice in community sentiment, maybe my voice is dominating community sentiment, which I don't really want to do that either. I don't really know how to reconcile all of that. The whole idea that like loud voices move ban and restriction updates kind of makes my stomach clench up because I don't really feel like that's how it should be. I've always advocated for a predominantly statistics-driven approach to format bans and restrictions. And of course, that system has its own pros and cons. It has its own flaws, right? There's always going to be cases where maybe a non-dominating card produces play patterns that the community or WotC doesn't really want to be part of the game. But for me, I feel that stats should come first and foremost, and that is currently not the case for Legacy and Vintage. Obviously, I showed you that clip in the beginning from WotC where they expressed the biggest thing is listening to the community and what the community feels like they want in their format, while also, of course, still doing some amount of metagame win rates, metagame shares, that kind of thing. And I'm not going to say that community sentiment isn't important. I just don't think it's the most important piece or it should be the driving piece. I help maintain these community data sheets so that we all have good and tangible data to help drive our arguments. We can see when a deck has a large meta share. We can see when it has a high win rate. And from there, we can like accurately discuss in terms of balance and diversity what is going on in our format. This video will probably end up being a little bit more rambly. Maybe some contradictions will appear because it's not really a deterministic science how to run a card game's ban and restriction list. There are multiple viable approaches and all have different pros and cons. Either way, this is where we're at right now, and I feel like I need to say something or else I forfeit my voice in the community, which is, I think, sad. I still think it's really sad. I would love that if I could just say nothing, maybe that would, push towards that nothing needs to change, but that doesn't seem like how it really works. And so for me, I would not recommend any restrictions or bans in Vintage at this time. We are in a format that's in flux. The addition of Aether Drift and Stock Up very particularly has pushed us into a new metagame naturally. The natural, slow deck building evolution of the Fleshraker Shops deck, combined with the Stock Up deck boosting the existing Lurrus Paradoxical Outcome shells, has somewhat suppressed the previous S tier deck in the format of Lurrus Control. Now, Lurrus Control did just put up a very strong performance in the most recent showcase event, 165 players, so it's possible that Lurrus Control is going to make a very huge comeback as well. And maybe it makes that resurgence, or maybe it doesn't, but all we can do is wait and see over time if that will happen. This is something that Vintage historically has been given a lot of. It's not a format that is viewed by many eyes. It's not a format where the ban restriction team is like looking at it super closely all the time. And so by nature of just not being looked at so much, we get a lot of time before restrictions typically happen. And this is, I think, a great thing because decks in Vintage come into the format and typically have a blisteringly high win rate, but they aren't immediately restricted. There aren't immediate calls for restrictions, and the community usually gives a lot of time for players and decks to adjust before we decide that a deck is too strong. I think one of the biggest and clearest examples of this is Mono White Initiative. Mono White Initiative burst onto the scene with win rates in the 60%, very high, definitely over the acceptable threshold. And it shot up to 25% of the metagame share at one point. It even won an Eternal weekend. But it wasn't restricted. What happened was the Vintage players adapted. They started playing more removal in their deck. They started changing their play patterns to beat Cavern of Souls by attacking the deck's fragile mana rocks. You're going to cast Force of Will on the Lotus instead of on the payoff creature because the payoff creature might be cast with a Cavern. And as players adapted their decks and their playstyle, Mono White Initiative has become a perfect example of a fair and balanced staple of the metagame. With a 10% meta share and win rates ranging between 48 and 52%, it keeps the format varied and diverse. It helps push an aggro creature-based deck into the format. It makes it so that the blue decks can't skimp on removal and creates games based around creatures. In a more trigger-happy ban and restriction announcement format, this might not have been allowed to occur. Players and community sentiment would have called for restrictions instead of adapting their decks. This is something I want Vintage to stay away from. We have the largest card pool in all of Magic, and from my years diving into the Vintage data, this pattern is a reoccurring one. I've watched many decks come in guns blazing, only to be answered by 30 years of Magic history and cards from the card pool. I have watched new cards enter the format naturally, even through standard sets, and turn the format on its head. So, with the metagame in flux right now, I don't see any reason to artificially change it. Let's let this play out and see what ends up on top. Will Lurrus Control return to being the top deck? Or has it been naturally suppressed? Is this new aggro combo workshop decks the real deal? Or will it fade away as people adapt their deck building and their gameplay? Even unrestrictions don't seem needed right now. If Aether Drift hadn't been printed, I think discussions around unrestrictions would have had a lot of merit. The format had been stagnant for a little while with the same decks at the top of the metagame and not much flux. That's the perfect time, in my opinion, to have unrestrictions to do a little bit of artificially pushing the metagame into a new cycle. Could we drive interest in this format and give the stable format a little shakeup by releasing these old cards that need to be that could be unrestricted? Yes. But I think right now we're not in a stable metagame like we previously were before the printing of Aether Drift and Stock Up. So for now, I'm not going to recommend unrestrictions either. Finally, let's talk about Lurrus. I think this is the card that probably has the most chatter about it in the community sentiment. Lurrus is a unique case because its companion text means it can't truly be restricted. Going from 4 copies to 1 doesn't change how the card is used right now. So what would it take to ban Lurrus? Well, we've already seen that happen, and it was actually banned on power level, one of the first cards in a very long time to have itself banned on power level. And what was needed was a clear and overwhelming power level issue. Lurrus basically made it so no other decks were viable. Now with Companion nerfed, could you still ban Lurrus on power? No, I don't think you can ban Lurrus based on the data showing that this card is not too powerful. There's no deck in Vintage playing Lurrus that dominates in meta share to the point where it'd be problematic, and there's no Lurrus deck in Vintage that has win rates that are overly high. Lurrus decks have been performing the best in the format, but the best deck is not a reason to restrict it. Just because the deck is the best deck does not mean you have to restrict it. So, you can see that we're not going to ban Lurrus on a power level issue. What you would actually have to do is ban it on a community sentiment issue. And this is why I start to get a little this is basically why I'm making the video. These statements that I say where Lurrus is not doesn't have too high win rate, doesn't have too high a meta share, I'm using, historically stated win rates and meta sizings from other WotC articles before they were using community sentiment as the main factor. They've previously done things like, 30% meta share in Vintage, or 55%, greater than 55% win rate in Premier events, or there's been a couple hints here and there of what their numbers are for acceptable win rate and meta share. And right now, and I guess not right now, but in the previously stable metagame of Lurrus Control was right about where you would start thinking about, is it too big? It was like 54% win rate. It was like 20-something% meta share, which was very normal for the best deck in Vintage. So that leads us back to community sentiment. The only way to get Lurrus banned is if enough people want that to happen. Is this a prevailing community sentiment? From my vantage point, maybe the person who interacts with the most Vintage players, I don't know if that's true, but it feels like it's true with the Discord and the stream community. I interact with lots of Vintage players from around the world, and I currently don't seem to think that is the case, at least not to the same level that Urza Saga was. I could very visibly see a large community sentiment where people disliked Urza Saga's metagame share, and some amount of it was play patterns of Urza Saga. And even if I didn't agree with that community sentiment, I could at least see the large community outcry over it, right? Whereas for Lurrus, it seems like it's more small vocal pockets of people who don't really like the cat, whether that's like a personal play pattern issues, or maybe some kind of theoretical homogeny issues over, deck building. Or maybe it's the fact that like Lurrus restricts you and pushes you away from playing 3 costs. That's kind of a weird, interesting part about Lurrus. I don't think that should be used as a huge portion of the argument, but I do see it used. And to me, I'm not seeing an overwhelming community drive to remove Lurrus. I'm seeing small community drive to some people want that. And I really don't want small vocal personal play pattern issues to be a forefront of community sentiment. Everyone enjoys Magic a different way, and everyone hates different aspects of different decks that they play against. And it's very good to have lots of options in how you want to approach Magic. That's part of the reason why having tons of formats is very important. But even inside of just Vintage, right now you have a lot of different ways to approach it. Whether you're trying to be a controlling deck, more of a combo deck, you want to play Workshop, you want to play Bazaar, you want to play an aggro deck, a mono-white aggro deck. And you'll find that while one player may hate the existence of a mono-white aggro deck, then maybe 10 players love being able to play a mono-white aggro deck inside of Vintage. And so you really can't let small personal play pattern preferences be your driving factor in ban and restrictions. And that's, I think, part of the worry I have with the idea of community sentiment over something like statistics, because it's very hard to determine, one, what is good for the game, and two, what do players actually want from the games? What do they say they want? What do they actually want? There's a lot of things going on there. And there's another thing to think about here, where there's some compelling arguments that the format will actually get a lot worse if you take away the best tool controlling decks have in Lurrus. What Lurrus does right now is, when we were talking about restricting and suppressing the ability to play 3-drops, one of the biggest and most controversial permanents that cost more than 2 is Bolus's Citadel. Tinkering out a Bolus's Citadel was a primary driving point of the Vintage metagame for years, to the point where people were actually talking about banning Bolus's Citadel, not restricting it because it was getting a 1-of Tinker target, just banning it outright because people were upset with how much it was happening. And if you take away Lurrus and start pushing Tinker Citadel back to the forefront of the metagame, is that really going to be better for the majority of people? Would more people rather have would they rather have their opponents tinkering Citadel against them or playing Cat? That's a hard question to answer. I'm not going to say that I know the answer to that question, but it's something I would worry about if we were to somehow have Cat removed from the format. Tinkering for a Citadel has won me a lot of money, but I believe that Tinker Citadel being a small portion of the metagame as opposed to a predominant portion of the metagame is a huge win for the format overall. Again, that's just my opinion though, and I don't want to shoehorn my preferences into for everyone else, you know. Okay, I'm getting pretty rambly at this point, so I think I'll cut it off here. There are lots of points that you can hit on in this broad topic. I could probably go on for another hour. But overall, what I want my main sentiment to be is that I strongly dislike the idea of community sentiment being the driving factor behind vintage ban and restrictions. I want it to be a secondary discussion after statistics. I want the first thing that they think about to be, are there any decks that control too much of the metagame? Are there any decks that have a win rate that is problematic? And then I want them to think about this community sentiment, this play patterns, and these kind of things. That is probably unlikely to change unless we were to move towards a community panel like Pauper, format panel, that has its own pros and cons. That can be its whole other video. But as for how WotC has discussed it in recent videos, they are, you know, adjusting legacy and vintage based on what the community says they want. So yeah, I'm strongly advocating right now. I'm voicing my opinion into the community sentiment that I would like for no unrestrictions, no restrictions, no bans moving into the March 31st update. While our metagame is in flux, let's wait and see how these new cards naturally move the metagame before we artificially try to do anything ourselves. And even right now in our flux, you know, our metagame that's in flux, we have a pretty healthy and diverse set of decks that are showing up. We were a little bit worried going into this recent showcase that the two most common new powerful decks, Lurrus PO and Raker Shops, would be having a crazy performance in the showcase, and that ended up not being the case. They were the two most played decks, but both of them had win rates below 50%. So we're going to watch and we're going to keep an eye on the metagame as it develops, and if we stabilize into another metagame where everything is pretty healthy and balanced, then we can look towards doing things like unrestrictions for PR. And what that means is unrestrictions to help drive interest and excitement about the format, things that will bring people in and up play rate numbers. Okay, so what do you think? Tell me what you think in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Hopefully I don't have to make too many of these banner restriction discussion videos, but I felt like I just had to. If you want to see more vintage gameplay content, make sure to check out this YouTube channel. Subscribe. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, new gameplay content. I'll see you then.